In the autumn of 1983, Haskell County, Kansas recorded the driest harvest season in 41 years. The aquifer beneath the southern plains had dropped 17 feet in a single decade. Banks in Sublette, Liberal, and Garden City were mailing out foreclosure notices faster than grain elevators were filling their bins. Across the county, 1 in every 3 family farms would change hands before spring came again. Most of them would not go to other farming families. They would go to corporations with names that sounded like law firms, words like Holdings and Partners and Agricultural Solutions printed on letterheads that had never felt a morning frost. It was in the middle of all of that, the dying, the selling, the quiet surrender, that Earl Mabry drove his 1967 Massey Ferguson down Highway 56, with a truckload of hard red winter wheat behind him and not a single dollar of debt to his name. That fact alone made people suspicious of him. Earl was 63 years old that fall. He stood about 5'9" on a good day, though years of bending over seed rows and climbing in and out of equipment had curved his spine the way a fence post curves when the wire is too tight on one side. His hands were the color of old saddle leather, cracked at every knuckle, with black soil worked so permanently into the lines of his palms that no amount of lava soap could scrub it loose. He wore the same kind of clothes every single day: dark canvas trousers, a chambray shirt faded almost white at the shoulders, and a John Deere cap that had been through so many seasons it had lost its original green and turned a kind of dusty sage color that matched the late October prairie perfectly. He had farmed the same 640 acres east of Sublette since 1951. Not a single acre more, not a single acre less. He had turned down 3 offers to expand, 2 partnerships with neighboring families, and 1 very serious overture from a cooperative out of Wichita that would have tripled his operation inside of 5 years. His neighbors thought he was stubborn. His nephew thought he was afraid. His banker, a man named Roger Tilden who had taken over Haskell County Savings and Loan in 1979, thought Earl was simply old-fashioned in a way that was becoming dangerous to his own financial well-being. Earl didn't much concern himself with what any of them thought. What he thought about, what he had always thought about, from the time he was 9 years old following his father across a plowed field in the gray light before breakfast, was the soil. Not land in the abstract, not acreage as a number on a deed, but the actual physical soil under his boots. The way it smelled after a slow rain. The way it crumbled between his fingers when it was ready to be worked and resisted like dry clay when it wasn't. The way certain patches of his east field had a slightly darker color than the rest because of an old creek bed that had run through there 1,000 years before any white man or Cherokee had ever looked at it, and how that darker patch always produced wheat with a higher protein content than the ground around it. He knew this because he tested it. Every year. In a small notebook he kept in the breast pocket of his shirt, Earl recorded the protein content, the moisture levels, the bushel weight, and the germination rates of wheat from 17 different zones across his farm. He had been doing this since 1959. He had 24 notebooks filled with this information, stacked in a wooden crate in the corner of his kitchen, next to a hand-painted picture of a wheat field that his wife Dorothy had made for him sometime in the late 1960s and which he had never once considered moving. Dorothy had been gone for 11 years by that October. Ovarian cancer, quiet and quick in the way that some of the worst things are. She had been gone before either of them had fully understood she was sick. Earl had continued farming the next morning after her funeral because he did not know what else to do with himself, and because the wheat does not wait for grief, and because he believed, in a way he could not have explained to anyone without embarrassing himself, that she would have been irritated with him if he had sat down and stopped. He did not talk about her much. But he still talked to her. Usually out in the field, where no one could hear him. The morning Earl drove into Sublette with his wheat, it was the kind of cold that comes to the Kansas plains in October without any particular warning, not the deep freeze of January, but a thin, mean cold that gets inside your collar and stays there. The sky was the color of old pewter, flat and featureless from one horizon to the other, and the town itself had the particular quiet of a weekday morning when people are working but not moving around much. Sublette Grain and Feed sat at the edge of town where the main road bent south toward Liberal. It was run by a man named Dale Cosgrove, who was 51 years old, thick through the shoulders, and had the particular confidence of a man who controlled something that other people needed. He wore pressed trousers even on the elevator floor and kept a calculator in his shirt pocket. He was not a cruel man, exactly. But he was a precise one, and his precision had a way of landing on people like a verdict. Earl pulled the Massey Ferguson into the lot and climbed down from the cab the way old men do, carefully, one hand on the doorframe, taking a moment at the bottom before letting his weight fully onto his knees. He walked to the office window and slid back the glass. "Morning, Dale." Dale was on the phone but held up one finger. Earl waited. A younger man named Cody, who worked the scale tickets, glanced up at Earl and then looked away the way you look away from something you find slightly uncomfortable. Dale hung up the phone and turned around with a look that was professionally neutral. "Earl. What VE you got?" "Hard red winter. Ought to go about 60 pounds to the bushel. I figure I got around 4,000 bushels out there." Dale pulled a clipboard from the wall and walked to the window, looking out at the truck. "We're running light on storage this year, Earl. Not real sure we can take on a full load right now." Earl looked at him steadily. "You taking from the Hendersons?" "We have commitments to larger producers, you understand. We've got contracts." "I'm not asking about your contracts. I'm asking if you're taking wheat today." Dale set the clipboard on the counter. "We had a quality issue come through earlier this season. Lot of farmers in the county didn't get the protein they were expecting. Dockage is going to be significant. If yours doesn't test out." "Test it," Earl said. Dale looked at him with the kind of patience that isn't really patience. "Earl, what I'm trying to tell you is..." "I know what you're trying to tell me," Earl said. He wasn't angry. He was very calm, the way the air gets calm before weather changes. "I'm asking you to test it before you tell me what it is." Cody was watching now, pretending not to. Dale took a breath and walked outside. He pulled a probe from the side of the truck and pushed it down into the wheat, turned it, and pulled a sample. He poured it into the moisture meter and waited. Then he poured it into the protein analyzer they kept in the back room and waited again. Earl stood next to him in the cold without speaking. The protein reading came back at 14.2%. The moisture was 12.8. The test weight was 62.1 pounds per bushel. Dale looked at the numbers and looked at Earl and looked at the numbers again. "That's about the highest test weight I've seen this season," Dale said. His voice had changed slightly, less verdict, more observation. "I know what it is," Earl said. "We're offering $7.50 a bushel right now, but with these numbers I could probably..." "I'm not selling today," Earl said. There was a pause. "You just drove in here to test it?" "I drove in here to find out if you'd take it. You told me you couldn't. So I'll take it somewhere else, or I'll store it. I've got the bins." Dale looked at him. "Earl, if you're holding out for prices to climb, I'd caution you. The report's out of Kansas City." "I appreciate the caution," Earl said. And he climbed back into the Massey Ferguson and drove home. Cody watched the truck pull out of the lot and looked at Dale. "What was that about?" Dale put the clipboard back on its hook. "Old man being proud," he said. But he said it without his usual certainty. Earl's farm sat on ground that had been in his family since his grandfather, a man named Wesley Mabry, had filed a claim in 1902. Wesley had come down from Nebraska with nothing but a mule, a handplow, a wife named Ruth, and an absolute conviction that the southern plains would produce if you treated them correctly. He had been wrong several times before he had been right. The Dust Bowl years had nearly finished the family entirely. Earl's father, James, had watched neighbors pack up and drive west, had watched fields blow bare down to the hardpan, had stood in the kitchen and listened to his own father cry in the bedroom, the only time Earl ever heard that Wesley did such a thing, and had still not left. They survived the Dust Bowl because Wesley had planted a 50-acre stand of native buffalo grass along the western edge of his property in 1924, and he had refused to break it, though everyone told him that ground was wasted and should be in production. That grass held the soil on the windward side. It wasn't enough to save them from heartbreak, but it was enough to save the farm. Earl had grown up hearing this story so many times that it had become less a story and more a kind of operating principle. The land tells you what it needs. The trouble is most people are talking when they should be listening. He had carried that principle into his own farming the way some men carry religion, not loudly, not as something he pushed on others, but as something he returned to every morning the way you return to the same chair at the same table because it is where you have always sat and the light is right. After the Dust Bowl, when the soil conservation programs came through in the 1930s, Earl's father had been one of the first in the county to implement contour farming and windbreaks. When the government offered to pay farmers to take marginal ground out of production in the 1950s, James Mabry had done it without hesitation, even though it meant less income in the short term. He understood, and had taught Earl to understand, that a farm is not a factory. You cannot run it at full capacity indefinitely without it breaking down. It needs rest. It needs restoration. It needs, sometimes, to do nothing for a season so it can do something extraordinary in the next one. Earl had taken this further than his father had. Beginning in 1967, he had started a rotation system that cycled a quarter of his ground into cover crops every year, Austrian winter peas and hairy vetch, mostly, which fixed nitrogen back into the soil and, when they were plowed under in spring, added organic matter that no commercial fertilizer could replicate. His neighbors thought this was eccentric. Some of them thought it was wasteful. A few of them, the ones who had gone deep into debt chasing the yields that the fertilizer salesman promised, had begun to notice by the late 1970s that Earl's ground was producing numbers they couldn't match no matter how much they spent on inputs. None of them asked him about it directly. Pride, mostly. And a reluctance to admit that a man who drove a 1967 tractor and didn't own a single piece of GPS equipment might know something they didn't. The winter that year was long and dry and worried people. By February, the winter wheat that everyone had planted in October was showing stress. The subsoil moisture was critically low. The Extension office in Garden City was putting out advisories almost weekly. There were meetings at the co-op and at the Lutheran Church and at the high school gymnasium in Sublette, and the consensus at all of them was that 1984 was going to be a very hard year. Earl went to one of these meetings. He sat in the back row and listened and said nothing. On the drive home he stopped at the west end of his property and walked out into one of his wheat fields in the dark with a flashlight. He knelt down and dug his fingers into the soil about 4 inches, feeling for moisture. There was some, not a lot, but some. He had known there would be. The cover cropping had built up the organic matter to the point where his soil retained water significantly better than the conventionally farmed ground around him. He had measured this, too, in his notebooks. He drove home and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Dorothy's painting for a while. "Going to be okay," he said to the room. "Going to be okay." He slept well that night. Spring came slowly, like it always does in the southern plains, not with warmth exactly, but with a gradual loosening, the light lasting a few minutes longer each evening, the mud in the feedlot getting tacky instead of frozen in the mornings. Earl walked his fields in March and April, sometimes for hours, sometimes covering the same ground twice if something had caught his attention. He was not inspecting in the way an agronomist inspects clipboard, data recorder, systematic grid pattern. He was watching. The way a person watches something they love. He noticed that his wheat was, by early April, several days ahead of his neighbors in terms of tillering. The ground held the heat better because the organic matter acted as insulation. He noticed that the stand was even, no thin spots, no places where the seed had rotted in wet pockets or failed in dry ones, because his seed selection process had been, for the past decade, extraordinarily careful. This was perhaps the thing that set Earl apart from other farmers in the county most dramatically, and also the thing most likely to make people dismiss him as eccentric. He saved his own seed. Not entirely, he was not impractical, but from his best performing zones each year, he collected a portion of the harvest and cleaned it himself in a small room off the main barn that had a hand-crank seed cleaner and a gravity table he had bought used from a farm in Oklahoma in 1971. He had been selecting, year after year, from the wheat that performed best on his specific ground, his specific soil chemistry, his specific microclimate, his specific combination of challenges and advantages. Over 20 years, this had produced something that was, while not a registered variety, a population of wheat extraordinarily well adapted to his farm. He called it simply Earl's wheat, not in pride but in the same matter-of-fact way you would name a tool for the person who used it. A seed company salesman who had come through the county in 1979 had offered to buy Earl's seed stock. Earl had said no. The salesman had told him that his home selection process was unscientific and that he was probably losing yield by not using a certified variety. Earl had listened politely and then had walked him to his car. By June, people were starting to talk. Earl's wheat was standing 38 inches tall in a county where most fields were coming in at 28 or 30. His heads were full, not the shriveled, pinched heads that water stress produces, but proper full heads that you could see from the road and that made people slow down their pickups to look. The color was right, that particular gold that is not quite yellow, not quite amber, the color that wheat is supposed to be and often isn't in a drought year. Word got around the way word gets around in small towns, which is everywhere and with no particular respect for privacy. Earl Mabry had a crop. A real crop. In the worst drought year in a decade, the old man with the rust-spotted tractor and the notebooks full of numbers had a crop. His neighbor to the west, Gary Sutherland, came over on a Tuesday evening and leaned on the fence at the edge of Earl's field. Gary was 44, had farmed 3 sections since his father died in 1977, and had spent the last several years in a kind of quiet financial freefall that he didn't talk about directly but that you could see in the deferred maintenance on his equipment and the way his wife had started cleaning houses in town 3 days a week. "I won't lie to you, Earl," Gary said. "I don't understand it." Earl stood next to him and looked at the wheat. "Nothing complicated about it," he said. "You didn't have rain any more than the rest of us." "No." "What fertilizer are you running?" "Not much. Some phosphate in the fall. That's about it." Gary took his cap off and scratched his head and put his cap back on. "I spent $14,000 on fertilizer and crop protection this spring," he said. "And I'm going to get maybe a third of what you're going to get." Earl didn't say anything for a moment. "You want to know what I think it is?" "Yeah." "Organic matter," Earl said. "And the right seed. That's about it. You build the soil up to where it can hold water and feed the plant from inside. You stop needing so much of what they're selling you." Gary was quiet. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the distance, that liquid 3-note call that means high summer in Kansas. "Takes a long time to build it up," Gary said. "Yes, it does. I don't have a long time." It wasn't self-pity, exactly. It was a statement of financial fact. Earl looked at him. "You holding on to your ground?" "Barely." Earl nodded slowly. "Come harvest, I'll have some seed I can let you have at cost," he said. "Not a gift. I don't do gifts. But at cost, and you can pay me when you sell next year's crop." Gary looked at him for a moment, and then looked away toward his own field. "That's decent of you, Earl." "It's practical," Earl said. "I'd rather have a neighbor than a subdivision." Harvest came in the last week of June, earlier than usual because the drought had pushed the crop to maturity fast. Earl ran his combine, a 1974 Gleaner that he had rebuilt himself 3 times and knew the way a surgeon knows a particular procedure, for 9 days straight, starting at 7 in the morning when the dew had burned off and running until the light failed in the evening. He had a hired hand for 2 weeks, a young man named Marcus whose family had farmed in the county until his parents were foreclosed in 1982 and who had been doing day labor since then. Marcus was 22 years old and worked without complaint in the heat that came down out of the sky like something pressing. He learned quickly and asked good questions and did not try to tell Earl anything about how to do things on Earl's farm, which Earl appreciated. On the 4th day of harvest, when they were running the Big East field, Marcus climbed up on the combine to check a plugged auger and called down to Earl. "How many bushels you thinking this field goes?" Earl looked out across the head that was waiting to be cut. He had been looking at wheat fields for 50 years. 52, maybe 54 to the acre, he said. Marcus looked at him. "That's. I know what it is. 53 bushels per acre." The county average that year was 21. When Earl came back to the elevator in early July with his grain, Dale Cosgrove was standing outside in the lot when the truck came in. Word had gotten to him, the way word gets to grain elevators because their whole business is knowing what the farmers have. Dale walked out to meet Earl as he was climbing down from the cab. "Earl," he said. "Dale. I hear you had a good year." "I had the year I expected to have," Earl said. He went to the back of the truck and pulled a sample probe from the toolbox. He was going to test it himself before he asked Dale to do anything. Dale watched him. "I want to apologize," he said, "for the fall. I should have taken your wheat." Earl pushed the probe into the wheat and drew a sample. He held it in his palm and looked at it in the July sunlight, the kernels plump and hard and full-colored. "You made a business decision," he said. "I don't hold that against you." "It wasn't a good one," Dale said. "Those numbers you had last fall were the best in the county. I should have recognized that. I left the situation with the other producers." "Dale," Earl said. "What are you paying today?" A brief pause. "$4.20 a bushel." Earl nodded. "I'll take that. I could push that to $4.50 for quality if you want, given the test weights you've been showing." "$4.20 is fine," Earl said. "I'm not trying to get every penny. I just want a fair price and a fair scale ticket." Dale looked at him with something that was not quite guilt and not quite respect and was probably some mixture of both. "You'll always get that here." "I know I will," Earl said. Not harshly. Just as a fact. It took 3 days to haul everything in. Earl had 51,000 bushels. At $4.20 a bushel, it came to a number that was larger than what most of his neighbors had received in the past 3 years combined. He paid his accounts in full, paid Marcus for his work plus a bonus that made the young man stand in the farmyard with an expression of disbelief, bought the parts he needed for the combine that he had been deferring for 2 seasons, and put the rest in the bank. Roger Tilden called him personally. "Earl, I want to talk about investment opportunities." "I appreciate that, Roger," Earl said. "I'll let you know if I need anything." He did not call back. The story might have ended there. Old farmer, good year, quiet dignity, except that what happened next was the part people in Haskell County were still talking about a decade later. In August, the crop forecasts for the region came out, and they were worse than anyone had expected. The drought had extended. The winter wheat that most producers had planned to replant in September was going to face a severe shortage of quality seed in the county. The certified seed dealers in Liberal and Dodge City had poor stocks. A lot of what was available was from stressed grain, low germination, low protein, the kind of seed that makes you feel better about planting than you have any reason to. Dale Cosgrove drove out to Earl's farm on a Wednesday afternoon in August and parked his truck by the barn and walked to where Earl was working on a section of fence near the south field. "I'm going to ask you something and I want you to know I understand if the answer is no," Dale said. Earl kept working on the fence. "Ask." "I've got 11 producers in this county that need seed wheat. Good seed. They're going to lose a year if they can't plant in September and they can't get clean seed. I know you've got your own stock put back." Earl kept working. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to sell some of your seed stock. At whatever price you think is right. I'll broker it. I'll handle the logistics." Earl straightened up and looked at the south field. It was bare now, harvested, the stubble golden in the afternoon light. It looked the way a field always looks after harvest, exhausted and open and resting. "Who are the 11, he said. Dale named them. Earl knew most of them. Gary Sutherland. The Hendersons, who had farmed the same ground since 1937. A family named Ortega who had come up from Texas in 1965 and built something real on the north side of the county. 3 younger farmers who had taken on family ground in the last few years and were still trying to figure out what they were doing. People who were here, who were trying to stay. "I set back 12,000 bushels for my own planting," Earl said. "I've got another 8,000 I could let go. That's not enough for everyone on your list." "I know. I'll sell 6,000 at cost and donate the other 2,000 to whoever needs it most," Earl said. He said it in the same tone he used for everything, not generous, not proud, not looking for credit. Just stating what he was going to do. Dale looked at him. "Earl. Don't make a thing of it," Earl said. "It's seed. It's meant to be planted. In the farmyard that September, 11 farm families and a grain elevator manager and a young man named Marcus who wanted to learn everything stood around a stainless steel seed cleaner in the open bay of Earl's barn on a bright cool morning that smelled of cut wheat and oil and dust. Earl walked them through the cleaning process and the selection criteria and the planting rates and the cover cropping system he used, explained it all with the plainness of a man who was not lecturing but simply describing something he knows well. Some of them wrote things down. Some of them just listened. Gary Sutherland stood at the back with his arms crossed and listened to everything Earl said with the expression of a man who was recalibrating. At the end, one of the younger farmers, a 28-year-old named Danny Henderson, fourth generation on his family's ground, asked Earl a question that was clearly something he had been working up to for a while. "Mr. Mabry," he said, "why didn't you ever expand? You could have. With what you know, you could have farmed twice this ground and spread myself out until I didn't know it anymore," Earl said. He wasn't dismissive. He was genuinely answering. You can only really know a piece of ground if you walk it. All of it. Every season, over years. The minute it gets too big to walk, you lose something. I didn't want to lose that. Danny thought about this. What do you lose? Earl picked up a handful of soil from the edge of the barn floor, where some had blown in from the yard, and held it in his palm. You lose the ability to listen to it, he said. And if you're not listening, you're guessing. I've never been willing to guess at this. He let the soil fall from his hand. You're farming for something, Marcus said from the back. He said it like he wasn't sure if it was a question. My grandfather farmed this ground, Earl said. My father farmed it. I've farmed it. If I do it right, somebody after me farms it. He looked at the open barn door and the autumn sky beyond it, the particular blue that comes to the plains in September, not the pale washed-out blue of summer but something deeper and clearer. That's the whole thing, he said. That's what it is. Earl walked his west field alone that evening, the last of the light going orange and long across the stubble, his boots making the small sounds that boots make on harvested ground. The meadowlarks were quiet. A few killdeer moved at the edge of the old creek bed, their cries sharp and clean in the cooling air. He stopped at the patch of darker soil above the creek bed and crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the ground. It was still holding the warmth of the day. It was, as it always was, alive, not in any mystical sense, but in the actual physical sense, teeming with organisms and chemistry and the slow patient work of decades of care. He had put 11 families' seed in the ground today. He had kept his father's farm and his grandfather's farm and Dorothy's farm, because it was hers too, every acre of it. She had walked every inch of it with him in the long evenings when the work was done and the light lasted, and her presence was in it the way you can't remove something that has been given freely and completely. He was 63 years old and his back hurt and his knees were going, and Roger Tilden's bank was not going to get this land, and Dale Cosgrove's elevator was going to take his wheat every year from now on with a great deal more respect, and next spring 11 farm families in Haskell County were going to plant his seed into their ground, and some of them were going to save seed from their best zones the way he had taught them to, and the year after that the soil would be a little better than. It was this year, and the year after that a little better still. This is how it works. Not fast. Not with dramatic reversals or sudden rescues. Slowly, the way good things go, the way soil builds, the way trust builds, the way a family's knowledge of a piece of land builds, generation by patient generation, in the notebooks and in the walking and in the willingness to listen to what the ground is telling you if you're quiet enough to hear it. Earl stood up and looked west, where the sky was going purple and the first stars were arriving. You'd have liked today, he said to the air. He walked back toward the house through the stubble, his boots making their small sounds, the dark coming on around him gently, the farm holding him the way farms hold the people who belong to them, from underneath, from all sides, in the particular weight of a place that knows you and that you know and that neither of you is ever quite willing to leave. The lights in the kitchen window were warm against the dark. He went in and put the coffee on and sat down at the table and opened a new notebook to the first clean page. He wrote the date. He wrote the yield. He wrote the protein numbers and the moisture numbers and the test weight. He wrote a note about the cover crop he would plant in the east field in October and the seed rates he was thinking about for the Henderson boys' ground. He wrote for about 20 minutes, in small neat handwriting that had not changed since he was a young man. Then he closed the notebook and set it on top of the stack, next to the painted wheat field on the wall. He drank his coffee in the quiet house, in the quiet farm, in the quiet county, in the middle of the vast and patient plains. Outside, the stars were bright and many over the dark fields. The soil rested beneath them, full of everything that had been given to it, ready to give back.